Going live now to the Rayburn House office building on Capitol Hill for a hearing on U.S. military operations in Asia and the Pacific. It is just getting underway.
As soon as you want to leave. But I wouldn't do that to our witnesses. At that point, you're on the list. So whenever you come back, you get in line. But that creates an inconvenient situation in that we're thinking somebody's next, then literally 2 minutes before it's their turn, if you come back and you're in line, you get to bump that person. So if you're sitting there thinking you're next, then all of a sudden somebody else gets called on, it's because somebody else came back in those couple of minutes. And that's in the rule. That's in the committee rule. So if you're here for the drop of the gavel, you're in line, and it's your turn. Whenever you come back, assuming you were in line, you get to jump anybody else who was there. Personally, I'm not in love with that rule. But then again, I approved it. So we'll think about that for the future, but that's the way it works. I say that also because, once again, we have a classified hearing after this. We're going to try to stop at noon. I will try to get people in who are here, but if somebody comes creeping back in at 11:57, that complicates things. So we're going to try to stop at noon, try to start the classified hearing immediately thereafter, but it'll be sometime between noon and 12:15. I'm sure our witnesses were fascinated by that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
On behalf of the members of the T&I committee, you have to go to markup and vote. We appreciate you covering for us.
Certainly. You will be missed, but we appreciate your giving us a heads up. Okay, we have our posture hearing this morning with the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and U.S. Forces Korea. Our witnesses are the Honorable Randall Schriver, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Department of Defense, Admiral Philip S. Davidson, Commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and General Robert Abrams, Commander, United Nations Command, Combined Forces, U.S. Forces, Korea. Welcome, gentlemen. Appreciate you being here, appreciate your service, and look forward to your testimony. Obviously, the Pacific region is a critical region. Both President Obama and President Trump have emphasized our need to place greater emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region, and we look forward to hearing about all of the issues around there. Obviously, China is the largest issue, working with them, but also working with countries around them to make sure that they are playing by the rules and respecting their neighbors. I think the number one most important thing is it is crucial to maintain a strong U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific region. I think our presence brings stability and makes it more likely that it is going to be a peaceful and prosperous place. Crucial to that also is building alliances. Our presence alone doesn't work unless we have friends and allies in the region who want us there, who see us being there as an asset to their interests. I believe we can do that, and I think we've done a good job of it. I want to particularly emphasize, as you note, this is the first year that is the Indo-Pacific Command, a change that we made in the authorizing bill last year to reflect the rising importance of India to our role in the region. I think the improvement of our relationship with the nation of India is one of the most positive developments in foreign relations of the last several years. I hope we can build on that and improve upon that. The most pressing questions we're going to have today is how do we deal with China on a wide range of issues? And militarily, what do we need to do to make sure that we have the equipment we need to adequately deter them from doing things that we don't want them to do? And then, as I said, how are we doing in terms of working with other key players in the region to form alliances to contain that threat? And then, of course, we have North Korea. Without question, the situation has improved in the last couple of years. I've had numerous people say that tension on the Korean Peninsula is lower than it's been probably since the end of the Korean War. Sorry, since the ceasefire that happened in the Korean War, since it has not actually ended at this point. Curious as to your thoughts of how we build upon that, how we continue to increase the stability, and hopefully eventually get to the point where we have a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. With that, I will turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Thornberry, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my welcome to our witnesses. We appreciate y'all being here today. I think in a lot of ways, some of the most important statements were on the first page of the written testimony that Admiral Davidson submitted. where he talks about what we've accomplished over the last 70 years, liberating hundreds of millions of people, lifting billions of people out of poverty. What has helped accomplish that, or what has provided the foundation for that progress, is commitment of free nations to work together, which I believe is your engagement, Mr. Chairman, as well as the credibility of the combat power of Indo-Pacific Command and a robust and modern nuclear deterrent. On the next page, I'll read one sentence. U.S. power underpins the post-World War II international system that helps strengthen the essential foundations of a rule-based international order for economic growth and prosperity in the region for everyone. I think that is absolutely true in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's absolutely true in the rest of the world too. And what I worry about is that we take some of those things for granted and could let them deteriorate with consequences that will result in a darker, more dangerous world. Sometimes I think we need to just remember the basics, and part of the basics is strong U.S. military presence and engagement are the key, not only in this region, but maybe as importantly as anywhere in this region, given what we see coming with China and the other challenges. So we'll go down into a lot of details about what that means for 2020 bill, et cetera, but I just think it's important to remember that combat power, that nuclear deterrent, that engagement have been very successful for 70 years, and we should not take those things for granted. I yield back.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Thornberry and distinguished members of the committee. Very pleased to be here this morning to talk about our defense work in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly honored to be sitting with my great colleagues, Admiral Davidson and General Abrams. Our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, we believe, will be made possible, can only be made possible with a robust military presence and combat credibility. We believe this vision and our aspirations are durable if we achieve those aims because they're founded on important principles that are widely shared and have benefited all the countries of the region and beyond. These principles include respect for sovereignty, peaceful dispute resolution, free, fair, and reciprocal trade, and adherence to international norms and rules. Though China has benefited as much as any country, perhaps more, from this order, China, under the current leadership of Xi Jinping, seeks to undermine this rules-based order and seeks a more favorable environment for its authoritarian governance model. China, of course, is not alone. We see other challenges. Russia is an authoritarian actor seeking to undermine the rules-based order. We see North Korea and their continuing dangerous behavior. We see backsliding toward illiberal governance in key countries such as Myanmar and Cambodia, which challenges norms related to human rights, religious freedom, and dignity. We see the persistent and evolving threats by non-state actors, including terrorism and criminal enterprise. And we see the persistent threat from non-traditional transnational threats, such as those emerging from natural disaster and changes to our climate. China's ambitions, though, are of pressing concern as the CCP seeks a different order. In the security domain, China devotes very significant resources to eroding our advantages and threaten our interests. There's perhaps no better example of this than Chinese actions in the South China Sea. Despite Xi Jinping's pledge made in the Rose Garden of the White House in 2015, China has militarized the South China Sea with the deployment of coastal defense cruise missiles and long-range surface-to-air missiles, and they threaten our interests as a result. We have a specific response, of course, in the South China Sea. Admiral Davidson and his forces fly, sail, and operate where law allows. We encourage other countries to do the same, either alongside us or unilaterally. But nonetheless, we're concerned with China's drive for a different security architecture in the region. And this matters because if the CCP's authoritarian approach becomes ascendant, we could expect several trends that would be unfavorable to us. We could see a weakening of sovereignty and a potential loss of access to global commons. We could see an erosion to our system of alliances and partnerships. We could see an undermining of ASEAN and its member states. And we could see a diminishment of respect for individual and human rights, and potentially even the normalization of the brutal repression underway in places such as Xinjiang and Tibet. Our policy response at the Department of Defense is through implementation of the National Defense Strategy, which outlines how we will effectively compete with China. This strategy has three major lines of effort. The first is to build a more lethal and resilient joint force, and of course this must take into account as a pacing mechanism China's and Russia's ambitions, their pace of modernization, and the growth in their capabilities. The second line of effort is strengthening alliances and partnerships. This is really a core advantage that the United States has. It not only enables our forward presence, but it also gives us partners who are more capable themselves in defending their own interests and contributing to upholding regional security. A key example of this is the work we're doing with the help of Congress through the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative. Our third line of effort is reforming the department for greater performance and affordability, and accordingly, this focuses on efforts to promote innovation, protect key technologies, and to harness and protect the national security innovation base to maintain our advantages. I should note the National Defense Strategy talks about competition, not conflict with China. Competition does not preclude cooperating with China where our interests align. And as we compete with China, we will continue to seek a military relationship with China that aims at reducing risk and continues to push China towards compliance with international norms and standards. We at the Department of Defense support our interagency approach to China, including efforts to counter China's global influence. And we are very supportive of our State Department in efforts such as the BUILD Act, which was another tremendous example of our work with Congress to give us better tools in this competitive environment. So to close, we work at the Department of Defense along with our colleagues in uniform to implement the National Defense Strategy framework to ensure we're on a trajectory to compete, deter, and win in our priority theater, the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Admiral Davidson.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for providing Assistant Secretary Schriver, General Abrams, and myself the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Indo-Pacific region. I'm also joined by Command Sergeant Major Tony Spadaro of Indo-Pacific Command as well, and I'm so glad he's here with us today. Let me say thank you for the significant support we have received from Congress over the last 2 years. The temporary relief from the Budget Control Act and an on-time fiscal year 2019 budget helped to restore the military readiness and the lethality necessary to safeguard vital U.S. national interests in the Indo-Pacific. But there is indeed more work to do. The Defense Department's proposed fiscal year 2020 budget will help the Department address the challenges described in the National Defense Strategy and ensure our military remains the most lethal force in the world. And this funding is critical to sustaining the readiness recovery while also increasing joint force lethality as we return to great power competition with both China and Russia. It bears repeating from what Chairman Thornberry read from my written statement earlier. For more than 70 years, the Indo-Pacific has been largely peaceful. This was made possible by the willingness and commitment of free nations to work together for a free and open Indo-Pacific, the credibility of the combat power of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command working with its allies and partners, and of course, the credibility of our nuclear deterrent as well. Our nation's vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific demonstrates our continued commitment to a safe, secure, and prosperous region that benefits all nations, large and small. And it continues to place strong alliances and partnerships as the foundation of our approach to the region. The vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific includes a whole-of-government approach with economic, governance, and security dimensions, and it resonates with our allies and partners across the region. Indeed, we are seeing a general convergence around its importance as Japan, Australia, France, New Zealand, and India have all put forth similar concepts or visions, and Indonesia is leading an effort within ASEAN to elaborate one as well. As the primary military component of the United States' efforts to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific, U.S. Indo-PACOM works with the rest of the U.S. government and a constellation of like-minded allies and partners to advance our shared vision. Now, there are 5 key challenges that I believe threaten that vision and our U.S. national interests. First, until the nuclear situation is resolved on the peninsula, North Korea will remain our most immediate threat. The recent summit in Vietnam clearly identified the U.S. and DPRK negotiating positions, narrowed the gap on a number of issues, and made clear that the United States expects final, fully verified denuclearization of the DPRK. The outcome of the summit also reinforces the need for General Abrams and I to maintain the readiness of our joint and combined forces on and off the peninsula. China, however, represents the greatest long-term strategic threat to the United States, and indeed the region. Through fear and coercion, Beijing is working to expand its form of communist socialist ideology in order to bend, break, and replace the existing rules-based international order and prevent a free and open Indo-Pacific. In its place, Beijing seeks to create a new international order led by China with Chinese characteristics, an outcome that displaces the stability and peace of the Indo-Pacific that has endured for over 70 years. China is using a variety of methods, including pernicious lending schemes like the One Belt, One Road, and promising loans or grants to extend their diplomatic and political reach by gaining leverage against the borrower's sovereignty. This is happening in the Pacific Islands with their South-South initiative, as well as closer to home here in the United States, where in just over a year, 17 Latin American countries have signed on to One Belt, One Road. The PRC's military activities expanded last year with the placement of anti-ship cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and radar jammers on disputed militarized features in the South China Sea in April of 2018. And today, they continue testing and development of advanced capabilities like fifth-generation aircraft, hypersonics, aircraft carriers, and counter space technologies. I'm also concerned about the growing malign influence of Russia throughout the region. Moscow regularly plays the role of spoiler, seeking to undermine U.S. interests and impose additional costs on the United States and our allies whenever and wherever possible. Terrorism and other non-state actors also pose threats to our vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific as they seek to impose their views and radicalize people across the region, as evidenced in 2017 when ISIS captured the southern Philippine city of Marawi, a city of more than 200,000 people. Lastly, the Indo-Pacific remains the most disaster-prone region in the world. It contains 75% of the Earth's volcanoes. 90% of earthquakes around the globe occur in the Pacific Basin, and many countries across the region lack sufficient capability and capacity to manage natural and man-made disasters. To address all of the challenges I mentioned, U.S. Indo-PACOM is focused on regaining our competitive military advantage to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific over the short and long term. We must field and sustain a joint force that is postured to win before fighting and, if necessary, ready to fight and win. U.S. Indo-PACOM's ability to prevail in armed conflict is the foundation of the combat credible deterrence and our ability to compete. By fielding and maintaining a joint force ready to fight and win, we reduce the likelihood that any adversary will resort to military aggression to challenge or undermine the rules-based international order. To meet this demand, my top 5 budget needs are focused on the following: increasing critical munitions, advancing our high-end warfare capabilities like long-range precision fires, enhancing and improving our persistent integrated air and missile defenses, evolving our counter-unmanned aerial systems capabilities, and by continuing to develop the exquisite set of tools uniquely provided by the Strategic Capabilities Office, DARPA, and our service research labs. These deliberate actions will help ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific and deny those who seek to undermine it in both peace, below the level of conflict, and in war. I must add that our 5 Indo-Pacific Treaty allies in Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand, they have all been steadfast in their support for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Let me close by saying our ability to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific is only possible with your support. So I would again like to thank this committee for your continued support to the men and women of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. General Abrams.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, and distinguished members of the committee. I've had the privilege to serve in this position as the commander of United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, and U.S. Forces Korea for just over 120 days. In that short time, I have assessed that the ROK U.S. military alliance is stronger than ever. Our combined force is a strategic deterrent, postured to respond to potential crisis or provocation, and if called upon, ready to defend the Republic of Korea and our allies in the region. Today in Korea, we have tremendous opportunities before us, as well as some great challenges. Ongoing diplomatic engagement between South Korea, North Korea, and the United States has led to a significant reduction in tension compared to the recent past, marked by missile launches and nuclear tests. Diplomacy is creating the opportunity for North Korea to choose the path of denuclearization, forge a lasting peace, and to build a better future for its people. And while diplomacy is not without its challenges, it remains the mechanism underpinning the transformation we have witnessed over the past 14 months as we've moved from provocation to détente. The first steps towards creating a better future for all Koreans have already begun. We have witnessed multiple presidential summits, inter-Korean dialogue, and international support to sanctions. The steps agreed to last April at Panmunjom and specified later in the Comprehensive Military Agreement, combined with the aforementioned diplomatic efforts, have all contributed to a marked reduction in tension on the peninsula and created mechanisms for the development of cooperation and confidence building, essential ingredients to the incremental process of making history on the peninsula. Still, I remain clear-eyed about the fact that despite a reduction in tensions along the demilitarized zone and a cessation of strategic provocations, coupled with public statements of intent to denuclearize, little to no verifiable change has occurred in North Korea's military capabilities. For instance, we are watching the ongoing Korea People's Army winter training cycle, including a slate of full-spectrum exercises, which is progressing along at historic norms, meaning that we have observed no significant change in the size, scope, or timing of their ongoing exercises compared to the same time period over the last 4 years. Further, North Korea's conventional and asymmetric military capabilities, along with their continued development of advanced conventional munitions and systems, all remains unchecked. These capabilities continue to hold the United States, South Korea, and our regional allies at risk. As such, I believe it is necessary to maintain a postured and ready force to deter any possible aggressive actions. Fielding our force in Korea requires a foundation of support and sustainment to meet warfighter needs. Today, that foundation is sound. It serves as the bedrock from which we deter aggression and ensure stability, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but in Northeast Asia. Our posture allows our diplomats to speak from a position of unquestioned strength as they work to achieve enduring peace and final, full, verified denuclearization of the DPRK. I also want to thank you for the support we have received from the Congress over the last 2 years as we have significantly improved the posture and readiness of our forces on the peninsula, from munition stocks to additional ballistic missile defense capabilities and much more. I cannot underscore enough the importance of the on-time appropriation in 2019, as it has enabled us for the first time in many years to make smarter investments, improve our planning, and provide predictability to our commanders in the field so they can sustain the hard-earned readiness that is essential for being a fight-tonight force. With the support of Congress, the recently submitted FY20 budget continues the work of improving and sustaining our defense posture. The readiness required to be a credible deterrent is perishable. We must continue to exercise the core competencies necessary to the planning and execution of joint and combined operations under the strain of crisis. However, we must also strike a balance between the need to train and the requirement to create space for diplomacy to flourish. As such, we have innovated our approach to training and exercises by tuning 4 dials that modify exercise design and conduct: size, scope, volume, and timing. Adjustments to these dials enable us to remain in harmony with diplomatic and political requirements without sacrificing warfighting requirements and warfighting readiness to unacceptable levels. Our combined forces, Republic of Korea and the United States, recently completed a significant step in our evolution by conducting the first of our combined command post exercises, Dongmeng 19-1. Earlier this month, we exercised tactical, operational, and strategic competencies to be prepared, should the call come, to respond to crisis, defend the Republic of Korea, and prevail against any threat. This training is built upon the relationships, lessons learned, and staff interactions derived from many combined training and exercise events conducted by our components and the Republic of Korea counterparts throughout the year. The ROK-U.S. alliance remains ironclad. It's been tested multiple times over the last 65 years and only becomes stronger. Our military partnership continues to deepen and broaden the long-standing relationships that exist at every echelon. On behalf of the service members, civilians, contractors, and their families on the peninsula, we thank all of you for your unwavering support. And I am extremely proud to be their commander and to work hand in hand with the Republic of Korea to protect our great nations. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned, as I think all of us mentioned, our presence in the region is very important, and that presence takes on many forms. But certainly in Japan and Korea, we have troops forward stationed there. There's been talk about, cost sharing, how much the countries that we have our troop presence in pay. Now, we, in my view, get an enormous benefit from that presence. But just for the record, are you satisfied right now that our partners in the region are paying their fair share of what the cost should be for our troops being there? Mr. Schriver, if you want to start with that.
I am, and I think the deals that have been struck to date have been mutually beneficial with our allies and ourselves. Of course, we're entering new negotiations shortly with both countries, and I expect the same outcome, that we'll get something mutually beneficial.
And there has been talk about this cost plus 50 idea. It's just a rumor. No one has confirmed it. But just for the record, I assume you would think that not a good idea and not a good approach to our negotiations.
I've seen discussion, mostly in the media. It's not anything we've been directed to seek, and it's not part of any formal guidance. And again, I think our President's view on burden sharing is known. We think there should be burden sharing, but we'll leave that to the negotiation when the time comes.
So would you directly comment on the idea that cost plus 50, is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, we haven't been directed to do it. I think we will try to seek a good deal for the United States, obviously, but I think it won't be based on that formula that I'm aware.
Yeah. And just for the record, a number of members of this committee, bipartisan, have expressed their concern that that approach would drive a wedge between us and our allies, which we don't need to do. All of you mentioned the importance of our alliances. Mr. Thornberry, I think, articulated it best on the international treaties, basically, countries with democracies working together to promote that greater freedom in the region leads to the greatest prosperity. What are the most important steps that we could take to shore up the various international treaties, organizations in the Indo-Pacific region, and what countries are most important to expand upon those relationships? What can we do to enhance that level of cooperation and that rules-based democratic approach to the region? Go ahead.
Well, thank you. I think we are not only strengthening traditional alliances and making investments with our traditional ally partners, but we are expanding the network. And India was mentioned, I think, in the opening comments as a great example of a partnership that we're investing a lot in. We've had our first 2+2. We're making great strides in the defense relationship. But I would say throughout maritime Southeast Asia, Vietnam, for example, is a country that is concerned about their own sovereignty, concerned about freedom of the seas in the South China Sea. We've expanded our defense relationship with the support of Congress there. I think there are a number of emerging partners. The Philippines, traditional ally, we're strengthening that relationship. So I see a lot of opportunity, and with my colleagues here, we're investing across the board when we can, because we see a strong demand signal. There is concern about the erosion of these fundamental principles.
Sir, if I could just build on Assistant Secretary Schriver's point, our values really compete well across the whole of the region, particularly when all that China has to offer is money. Our ability to expand those values, protect them absolutely, but expand them to others, I think is going to be critically important as we seek new partners and the whole of a free and open Indo-Pacific concept. It's going to require some work. It's at the heart of my engagements, I know. I know whenever Assistant Secretary Schriver travels through the region, he's doing that as well.
So it's your sense that the authoritarian approach of China is really rubbing a lot of countries in the region the wrong way and pushing them more towards us?
I think everybody recognizes that a country with a closed and authoritarian internal order would be a threat to a free and open international one, yes.
And then just a final question. Are there countries in the region that you see as slipping more towards China's influence that we need to work harder to try to pull back?
Well, two of the countries was mentioned by Assistant Secretary Schriver in his opening statement, and that is indeed Myanmar and Cambodia. These are places in which a whole-of-government approach that extends those values is going to be important. And we're going to have to find the areas in which we can indeed compete with China there. It's going to be difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Thornberry.
Admiral, I want to go back to engagement for just a second. At the initiative of this committee in previous years, we have created an Indo-Pacific Stability Initiative. And the idea was, you see that the European Defense Initiative was pretty successful, both in funding needed improvements, but also sending a message that we're here and we're coming with dollars, not just the Chinese, but we're coming and we are committed to, in that case, of course, a NATO alliance. Now, I understand there are differences in the Pacific, but I'm concerned that I don't believe the administration has requested a specific dedicated funding for this initiative, even though it is authorized in law now. Can you comment about the benefit, if any, that you see to having this sort of Indo-Pacific Stability Initiative to help make it, to help training, to help facilitate military cooperation in various ways, again, somewhat on the idea that we have pursued successfully in Europe?
Yes, sir. I think the ERI model has been very successful for porting resources and sending capabilities to Europe in a place in which there had been some capability and capacity withdrawal in the few years before that. While there has been no money either appropriated or asked for with the IPSI, the fact of the matter is I put down a pretty assertive issue nomination last year for some capabilities and capacity needed in the theater, and I think in the FY20 budget you're seeing a down payment on that this year. Thanks.
Well, I'll just comment, Mr. Schriver. One of the requirements in I believe last year's bill was we need a plan from OSD about how you would fund various elements of this initiative. We hadn't gotten it yet, so y'all work on that because we intend to pursue it. I just wanted to ask General Abrams briefly. You talked about North Korean military activities that are unchecked. What can you say in this format specifically about their production of missiles and nuclear weapons? Has there been a change? We know they have not tested, but in the production of nuclear weapons and material and missiles, has there been a change?
Sir, their activity that we've observed is inconsistent with denuclearization. And we'll be happy to go into as much detail as you want this afternoon during the closed session.
Yeah, I just didn't know how far you could go in an open session, but I appreciate that. I think gives us a direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses this morning. Admiral Davidson, on page 14 of your written testimony, again, you talked about, again, some of the challenges for increasing joint force lethality, the undersea warfare provision. Again, you, I think, very clearly stated sort of what's happening in that domain with, as you put it, 160 of the submarines in the Indo-Pacific region belong to China, Russia, and North Korea. And again, as you go on to describe, that's happening at the same time as our fleet size is shrinking. Again, just to finish that thought, Vice CNO Admiral Mers testified before Sea Power yesterday, again, who just sort of walked through our attack fleet size right now is 51. And with the retirements of the Los Angeles class, it will be at 42 by 2026. So given the fact that, again, you don't get all of those, that subforce, right? You get about 60% of it with the allocation to the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region versus other combatant command areas there. You know, that trajectory, which Admiral Harris, your predecessor, described repeatedly in his visits to our committee over the years, is a big concern. And obviously, it's not getting any better, I assume, based on your written testimony. Again, I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sir, the undersea domain, despite the capacity shortfalls, the number of submarines is an area in which we hold an asymmetric advantage over virtually, well, all our adversaries. It's a critical advantage that we need to extend. The capacity limitations as we go down over the course of the next several years is indeed a threat to the day-to-day operations that I think we need to have in the theater. For presence needs and risks RO plans to a certain extent as well. I'd be happy to talk about more details as we get to this later session.
Sure. So Admiral Harris in open session actually testified that only about 50% of the stated requirements for subs can be met, given, again, the fleet size today as opposed to where we're, I mean, again, that was open testimony. Is that still pretty much the state of play?
My day-to-day requirement is met by slightly over 50% of what I've asked for, yes.
Okay, so, you know, this committee actually tried to change that last year in terms of at least getting some uptick in terms of the build rate, which, again, the administration opposed and was therefore blocked. The new budget embraces that belatedly, and again, just it would help, I guess, the cause in terms of your choices that you have to make out there if again, we move forward with a 3 sub build rate for this year's budget year, which actually will not be executed until 2023. And I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, sir. I mean, it's doing our best to reverse the trend on the way to force structure of 42 in the 2026 timeframe is a critical need in the Indo-Pacific, yes.
Thank you. I'd like to just change the subject for a minute to talk about recently, the Coast Guard actually was part of a deployment in the Straits of Taiwan. The Coast Guard National Security Cutter Bertolf participated in that. And again, I just wonder if you could talk about that part of a sea service in terms of helping, again, U.S. presence in international waters.
Yes, sir. The Bertolf is on deployment in the Western Pacific. It has been for several weeks now and will be for a few months to come as well. They're a very important partner with the U.S. Navy on really all things in the region. In fact, the mission that they were doing not long before the Taiwan Strait transit was helping us to enforce UN sanctions against North Korea and the illegal transfer of oils in ship-to-ship transfers there in the East China Sea. The Coast Guard has key relationships across the region, particularly for a lot of nations that don't have militaries, but they have perhaps defense forces and even less in some instances where there are just law enforcement forces. Because it really helps with key challenges that some of these nations have, whether it's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, narcotics or human trafficking, maritime domain awareness. So they're an important contributor across the whole of the region. I've got a good relationship with Linda Fagan, the Coast Guard's Pacific Area Commander.
And again, real quick, we're about to, I just want to thank you for putting the spotlight on that. During the shutdown, there was this view that, you know, again, this was not part of the DOD fabric, and obviously what they're doing out there really rebuts that narrative.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time has expired. We'll go to Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, I'm going to ask you a question concerning China's nuclear forces. And like the two prior questioners, as the chairman said, I'm very much aware that we're going to have a classified session, but I am looking for a full non-classified answer in this session because, as you know, as you give us information, it helps us formulate policy not just by ways in which we know, but by ways in which we can in non-classified areas be able to share the information with others as we advocate. I'm going to follow on to the theme that Ranking Member Thornberry had of using our NATO alliance as a question that comes to us in this area. The United States has backed away from the INF treaty with Russia, which is largely viewed more as a European issue than another theater issue. However, that we know that it also affects our relationship with China, and as we look to China's modernization of its nuclear forces, the INF is a relevant concern there. And we look at your testimony, page 6, China is undertaking hypersonic glide vehicles, electromagnetic railguns, and this is, I think, the most important sentence. You said Beijing is also modernizing and adding new capabilities across its nuclear forces. So here we have a near-peer adversary that's adding new capabilities across its nuclear forces. So this is not just a sustainment issue, just trying to modernize what we have in our inventory that might be requiring updating. This is actually new capabilities that they're doing. You then go on to say that they have nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, which will be armed with JL-3 sea-launched ballistic missiles, a road-mobile nuclear and conventional capable intermediate-range ballistic missile, road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missile, and you go on. So my question relates to the United States is now leaving the INF, and it poses both an opportunity as we look to our own capabilities, but also an opportunity diplomatically. So would you please give us some characterization of the threat that China poses and the intermediate range missile threat? What operational importance non-INF compliant assets to the United States would represent in this changing environment? And then what would be the benefit of a possible Russia-China-U.S. deal on an INF treaty, in that we know that when the United States entered into this, there were significant assets that were dismantled. So it's not as if we can just say we can't reach this because people have these assets. These treaties at times have even resulted in lessening conflict by destroying weapon systems. Admiral, could you give us a picture of that?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Long question. China, let me put it this way. At the operational level, about 93% of China's total inventory, if they were a party to the INF, would be in violation of that treaty. These missiles number in the hundreds, and we can talk more specifically about that later today, and present a serious challenge to not just the United States, but all of our allies, partners' freedom of action in the region. Our, at the operational level, long-range precision fires are constrained to just air and sea assets right now. With a wider set of capabilities with the United States, you really present a problem to the Chinese or the Russians, and you improve our freedom of action by presenting a like dilemma to them. So I think that's critically important. I need to add that Secretary Schriver should talk policy here a little bit.
With respect to any kind of future arrangement, of course, it's not under active consideration because we're not quite out of the treaty yet. But given the significance of China's capability falling in this range, certainly it would make sense to, if we were to go down that path of another agreement, to think about China being included. I can't see it being meaningful without China.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Davidson and General Abrams, I apologize. Last year, I led an effort to ensure that we have a floor on our troops in U.S. forces Korea. What do you think is the appropriate number of U.S. troops to have on the peninsula to maintain deterrence against Kim Jong-un?
Congressman, our current troop levels that we have with both assigned and rotational forces is appropriate and meets our requirements to provide an adequate and credible deterrent to the DPRK.
Admiral?
I fully agree with that.
Great, and I think this will be, I think you kind of already answered this next question, whether you can confirm that our force posture in Korea and Japan is designed to provide the best deterrence versus North Korea.
Yes, sir. I think our current force posture does do that. Of course, it takes other forces off the peninsula as well. And as General Abrams mentioned in his opening comments, the committee and the department have done a lot in the last 2 years to make sure that that capability is sound.
Thank you, Admiral. So with that in mind, let's go through some projects that the Pentagon has given us that could be rated to fund the President's border wall. And just please tell me you think each project is more or less important than a wall on the southern border. $17.5 million for command and control facility at Camp Tango, Korea. Do you want me to just go through the four? Do you want to go? I have about 3 or more questions after this.
I'd appreciate the list, Congressman.
Sure.
I'm ready.
Yeah, $53 million for a UAV hangar at Kunsan Air Base in Korea. $45.1 million for munition storage facilities in Guam, and $23.8 million for corrosion control hangar for C-130s in Yokota, Japan. Are these more or less important than a border wall?
Congressman, and I can only speak to the 2 projects that are in Korea. They're certainly important to U.S. Forces Korea, but it's inappropriate for me to gender some sort of judgment, as we've got to take into account all of national security. Mm-hmm. I'm responsible for providing a credible, properly postured force on the Korean Peninsula, and we'd have to defer that to, the acting Secretary of Defense. Or
yeah, I understand, Joe. I don't want to put you in a tough spot, but you would agree that at least those facilities that you're familiar with in Korea are very much necessary to force protection and deterrence on the peninsula, correct? Without making a judgment on the wall.
Right. I'm just pausing just for a second. So not necessarily for force protection, but principally for command and control and sustainability. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, General. Mr. Schriver, we often hear about the need for munitions, the need for intelligence and surveillance, ISR platforms, and the need for airlift and sea lift to flow forces into the region quickly. General I'm going to mess up this name, General O'Shannessy told the Senate Armed Services Committee last month that there is no military threat at the southern border. In light of that, why would the department use money allocated for a real threat like China or North Korea to pay for a wall that doesn't help us with a real threat versus a real threat?
I think as Secretary Shanahan, Acting Secretary Shanahan said yesterday, we've made arguments based on what we think our defense priorities are. We now have a lawful order from the President to execute, and we're looking how to best do that.
Thank you, Mr. Schriver. I think what I'm trying to, and I'm sure, again, I don't want to put you in a difficult spot. Well, the one thing that I'm trying to highlight is that we do have real threats that are existential threats, to our alliances, to our country, and potentially to the world. And when we're choosing to use our military funds that are very limited and resources for something that is an imagined threat, I think that is a problem, especially for us on this committee. Mr. Schriver and Admiral Davidson, I understand that we are more frequently using freedom of navigation patrols to push back on illegal Chinese claims in the Pacific. What else can we do to ensure that China doesn't present us with a fait accompli as we think they're about to do, or they're willing to do, I should say?
I think they have changed some facts on the ground with the militarization of those outposts. Our goal is to make sure that that doesn't become a tool to operationalize an expansive illegal sovereignty claim. So the freedom of navigation operations you mentioned are important. We've taken other steps. Along with Admiral Davidson's predecessor, we disinvited China from RIMPAC and pointed to their activities in the South China Sea as a reason for that. We've encouraged other countries to join in presence operations, joint patrols, and our responses in the future may not necessarily be on point. Their activities in the South China Sea could be met with consequence elsewhere, as I think was the case with RIMPAC. So we are intent on making sure that no one country can change international law or the norms.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Conaway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joe, thank you. Following on that line of questions, Xi Jinping's statements at any point in time, I don't think can be taken at face value. You mentioned his comments in the Rose Garden in 2015. I can't believe that he didn't already know that they were going to, as you said, militarize those islands. China has a longer-term horizon than most of us. We go, continuing resolution to continuing resolution or year-to-year budgeting. each step of the way, they seem to allow some period of time for a new norm to establish itself. The new norm are these features, as Admiral Davidson refers to them, have now been militarized. What do we think? What can you share with us in this arena? What you think the Chinese steps might be next in terms of trying to gain control? I think there was a dust-up between them and Malaysia on one of their features recently. And are there? Can we see ahead what the Chinese might do next that we would need to try to counter and not let that become the new norm?
Sir, in the operational space, one of the things we're starting to see is a higher degree of integration with forces that are not actually on those features. So we're seeing fighter patrols, bomber patrols, the integration of ISR aircraft, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and ASW aircraft actually operating from those bases, and a higher degree of interoperability between some of the base functions and the afloat forces that they have in the area as well.
So counters to that would be us continuing to operate in the international waters?
Certainly. Mr. Schriver mentioned earlier the importance of allies and partners operating with us in the region. That stepped up last fall and I think was a critical factor in the international response there and some of the behaviors that we saw out of China in both the battle space and the diplomatic space back in the fall. And I think that's going to be a critical approach going forward, is to have our allies and partners operating with us in the region.
So without telling us what they are necessarily, are our crews, sailors, airmen, are they aware of what their self-protection steps should be should something come up suddenly?
Yes, sir, absolutely. I know Admiral Aquilino has met with his commanding officers a number of times, both in the Western Pacific and on the west coast of the United States. And I've talked directly with General Brown at Pacific Air Forces as well to make sure that everybody understands the authorities that they have and to be sure to ask for the authorities they need going forward.
All right. General Abrams, I suspect I know the answer to this, but you mentioned in your testimony that tensions on the peninsula have relaxed or seem reduced dramatically. The North Koreans continue to exercise. Is there any sense among our Korean allies, South Korean allies, that they are less likely to defend themselves? Are they becoming too relaxed or at risk of being unprepared should the North Koreans do something?
Congressman, absolutely not. ROK military continues to train intensely at echelon. Very capable, very highly trained, committed, dedicated professional force. They have not taken their foot off the gas.
All right, thank you. You go back.
Mr. Cisneros is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just kind of want to follow up on that question as far as we go with the training. You know, in the military, drilling, exercises, train. Kind of like our piano teachers told us, if we took piano lessons, practice makes perfect. That's what we're striving for. If we're canceling or downgrading some of these exercises that we've traditionally done to prepare our forces there on the Korean Peninsula, how are we making that up? How are we continuing to training? How are we continue to make sure our prime operation to make sure that we're ready?
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity. First, let me clear up some misinformation. I assumed command on the 8th of November. Just since November, as of last week, we've conducted 82 combined ROK U.S. military field training exercises at appropriate echelons. So training has continued. Combined training has continued. In terms of large-scale exercises, everyone's well aware that last August we postponed one of our 2 annual exercises. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis, challenged me to be creative and innovative, develop an exercise regime that meets our warfighting readiness requirements while simultaneously creating and preserving space for diplomacy to work. Worked hand in glove with ROC Chairman in December, crafted this new construct, adjusting 4 dials, size, scope, volume, and timing of these exercises. We briefed them up our respective chains of command, had them approved, and then we've recently executed it. We met all our training objectives, trained all our mission essential tasks, validated our command control communications and ISR plans, and validated the alliance decision-making process. Very rigorous, tough, demanding command post exercise that's driven by a simulation. I'm happy to go into more detail in the classified session as to what made it so rigorous and so forth, but we are a trained and capable force ready to meet our treaty obligations.
Are we continuing joint training operations with our naval forces in the region too, and with our Marines and the Air Force as well?
Sir, absolutely we are. And the biggest difference is we just don't talk about it publicly.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then just to kind of follow up on that, the President says he's canceling these exercises. We're saving $100 million. That money's already been appropriated for your training and operations. What are we doing with that $100 million that we're saving when he's canceling these operations?
Congressman, I can't speak. I know what has been executed, what's been planned for, programmed for U.S. Forces Korea, and we are executing our appropriated budget as we have planned and programmed.
Mr. Schriver, do you have any idea what we're doing with those the $100 million that we're saving there by canceling these operations?
We are, at the request of Congress, looking at the cost differential between the previous exercises and our program now. I'm not aware that we have a plan for specifically what to do if there is a significant cost differential and how we would use that money.
I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Abrams, I have several questions for you, but thank all 3 of you for your service to our country in your various capacities. This committee has worked hard to to approve a joint emergent operational need to provide enhanced missile defense capability to our forces on the Korean Peninsula. Over the past year, what progress has been made on the specific GEON efforts to enhance missile defense?
Congressman, thanks very much for that, and we are grateful for the support from the Congress of the United States on that joint operational needs statement. Principally three capabilities. All 3 remain in development. They're all on time right now. The first and most important capability is slightly ahead of schedule, and we hope to have it fielded here in the next 12 to 16 months.
Excellent. Thank you. And then what is the status of the revised missile guidelines with our South Korean allies, and what is their planned path forward on missile development, and how do we factor that into joint operational planning?
Congressman, I think if I have your question right, that is one of the capabilities that's part of our conditions-based OPCON transition plan. In an unclassified setting, their progress continues on track. They've got a plan. It's been resourced in their budget, and I'm happy to provide some additional information this afternoon in a closed session if you desire.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. Thank you. Now with Admiral Davidson, I have a question. In the issue of readiness, if we have a conflict with a peer competitor in the Indo-Pacific theater, do we have enough ammunition stocks on hand and pre-positioned to fight and win a war? And along with that, how much supply do we have, and what are our risks if we don't have enough on hand pre-positioned?
Sir, I'd like to take the most of that question down to the closed hearing if we could. I will say that in stocks in the theater of critical munition supplies is a challenge and an ongoing challenge, and one of my consistent requests of the department as they pursue their budgets, as well as the ability to resupply out there, that remains a need as well, and I'm happy to get into more details.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the answer, and I look forward to that as well. And General Abrams, back to you. We've heard concerning rumors about the level of investment the South Koreans have made in their own provision of armaments, calling into question the viability of our operational plans because they don't have enough precision-guided munitions. Where do they stand with PGMs and small arms acquisitions to support our joint requirements?
Congressman, I prefer to talk about that in a classified session. Those numbers are classified.
Okay, excellent. I'll look forward to that one as well. Okay, I'll try another one that maybe we can address here openly. And this is a more broad and question, and I'm sure we can take it here in public. It's a sensitive topic, but trilateral cooperation between the South Koreans and Japan is essential to our common security. So what is your assessment of the level of trilateral cooperation, especially between these two very important security partners?
Sir, I think that the most key evidence right now is at the Enforcement Coordination Cell that the U.S. sponsors in Yokosuka, Japan. We have both Japanese and Korean partners sitting side by side, helping to enforce the UN sanctions regime against North Korea and the illicit transfer of oil and ship-to-ship transfers there in the East China Sea and Korea Bay. I think that's an important bellwether to keep in mind, that we're working in a very collaborative, cooperative, and totally transparent manner at sea, in the air, and in the coordination of those forces in a single headquarters.
Thank you. I'm very encouraged by that. I appreciate your answers. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Schriver, thanks. Good to see you again. Have a follow-up on Mr. Cisneros' questions with regard to training on the peninsula. And I was wondering, do we have any demonstrable or tangible action from the DPRK in response to cessation of readiness exercises on the peninsula?
On our core area of interest and concern, the issue of denuclearization, we have not seen any progress to speak of.
So would it be fair for me to conclude that we gave up something for nothing as a result? If I said that if that was my thought, would you say that would be a reasonable conclusion?
I certainly understand the concern. I think what we've tried to do is create an environment for a diplomatic process to unfold. In Hanoi, we were disappointed that the North Koreans weren't prepared to talk about how to fulfill Chairman Kim's pledge. Our door is still open for diplomacy, but to date we have not seen movement on denuclearization.
Yeah. So the next question is, what should we expect from this diplomacy?
We expect them to fulfill Chairman Kim's pledge made at Singapore, which is to pursue complete denuclearization, and we'd like them to start by identifying a common shared definition of what denuclearization means, and then we can build a roadmap alongside them on how to achieve that. But ultimately, it is the full, final, verifiable denuclearization that includes all categories of weapons of mass destruction and missiles and other delivery systems.
Do we have a timeline under consideration when we will restart full readiness exercises? When will we stop waiting for North Korea?
Congressman, we are looking to the President and the Secretary of State and their judgment on how the diplomacy will go, and they'll give us the signal of how to make adjustments in the future if they so determine.
Is that thanks for that. Is that the Pentagon's role in this? Is to wait for a signal? Are you in fact just waiting for, as opposed to injecting any information into this discussion in the administration?
Well, I think as General Abrams indicated, the objective is to do both: give our diplomats space and maintain readiness through the adjustments that have been made. If there are risks associated with a prolonged posture like this, we would certainly make those known, and we have made known our interests in all the things we think we need to do to maintain readiness, and I think General Abrams is doing a tremendous job on that regard.
Thanks. I want to not follow up. I have another set of questions for you on the actual budget related. We talked about this a couple weeks ago on the strategic support forces that China has created in the reorganization of the PLA. And I'm wondering how the budget proposed to Congress reflects perhaps a response or an attempt to get ahead to the reorganization of the PLA specific to the SSF development.
I think that I would primarily point to increased investments in cyber in that regard, both in terms of the resiliency and protection of our own infrastructure, as well as expanding the competitive space. We can talk about that more in the closed session. But given the mission of the Special Security Force, I think that's the area I would point to.
Yeah. So I think from my first set of questions, you'd probably understand General as well. I wanted to ask the policy guy, because it's really more of a policy set of questions about my concern about that we seem to be giving up something big for not anything, for nothing from DPRK as part of these negotiations. And it's something I think it's worth exploring for this committee as well. Continue to press on this question and expect that to happen. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us. Admiral Davidson, I'm going to begin with you. Earlier this month, General Scaparrotti spoke about the challenges he faces in the European Command, saying he was really 2 destroyers short, needed a better presence of both the Carrier Strike Group and Amphibious Ready Group there to counter Russian aggression in the area. And I wanted to ask you 3 yes or no questions, and then I want to get you to elaborate. Would you say that there is a sufficient attack submarine presence in the Indo-Pacific?
They are not meeting my requirement, no.
Would you say you have a sufficient Carrier Strike Group presence in the Indo-Pacific?
That's also below what I've requested.
Would you say you have a sufficient Amphibious Ready Group presence in the Indo-Pacific?
That's slightly below what I've requested.
Okay. The map you gave us, I think, is very telling. There's lots of blue on here. Your AOR has a significant amount of area that requires a naval presence. I know that the Navy is going through a force structure assessment, looking at what the future Navy should be, the types of ships. Have they consulted with you to look at your needs, to assess the risks that are going to be there in the future, and have they talked to you in the respect of being able to help you reduce your risk to an acceptable level as you manage this AOR in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, sir. No, the Navy staff is completely aware of the existing contingency planning and where we're going in the new global campaign plan construct, and it's informing this force structure assessment that they have ongoing right now.
Very good. Thank you. Assistant Secretary Schriver, yesterday Secretary Shanahan spoke before this committee, and he was discussing the administration's budget, and we were talking about those things that were in it, but also those things that were not in it. One of the things that's concerning is the reduction overall of the number of aircraft carriers out to 2027, with taking CVN 75 out of the inventory, which actually takes us down to 9 aircraft carriers. And I'm curious if you would discuss with us and give us the thought behind the analysis with the shipbuilding projection that going down to 9 carriers between now and 2027, which is what retiring CVN 75 early would bring. Do you think that in relation to what Admiral Davidson has just told us, do you think that puts us at an acceptable level of risk with Navy presence around the world?
Well, those decisions, those trade-offs go beyond my purview. I do share the
acceptable or non-acceptable risk.
Yeah, I think I have to defer to the leadership that has to make the global considerations on trade-off. I am concerned about any shortcomings identified by the warfighters, such as Admiral Davidson.
Okay, very good. Admiral Davidson, in your best professional military judgment, would you say that reducing the number of carriers with taking out CVN 75 in the inventory, do you think that leaves you and your availability with having Carrier 2.0 presence? Do you think that leaves you with an acceptable level of risk?
Sir, as I think about the future and the capability of the aircraft carrier I don't see, as I constantly revisit our campaign planning and our presence needs, I really don't see the requirement going down.
Okay, very good. Do you see, too, in the region, as you work with your allies there, we had talked earlier about making sure that we are coalescing resources, jointly operating, doing joint operations. Do you believe that with potentially having fewer carriers available, do you believe that that sends a signal to them as to our commitment in the Indo-Pacific region as far as our naval presence?
Sir, I would say our allies and partners across the region watch everything we do across all of the joint force, the level of participation we provide in exercises, what our current operations are doing, and they take signals from that, absolutely.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Admiral Davidson, economic, military, and diplomatic efforts should all be coordinated in order to implement an effective and coherent strategy. When one of these elements of power goes rogue, it impacts our overall strategy. What value do economic sanctions provide to our military strategy on the Korean Peninsula? And two, can you speak to the North Korea's illicit sources of funding and what efforts Indo-PACOM is taking to reduce those sources?
Yes, sir. I mean, most importantly, we're supporting the State Department's pressure campaign. The regime's ability to sustain its funding or gain funding from outside, it really undermines our diplomatic effort because it fails to bring them to the table. We work with our law enforcement partners as well as posts across the region on everything that North Korea might be doing across the economic and diplomatic space as you indicate. We should note that what they're doing comes in the form of outright counterfeiting, comes in the form of cyber theft really across the globe and not in just the region. And we're certainly in coordination with law enforcement and the rest of the government on those issues, but they're actually in the lead there.
How effective are our sanctions right now?
Well, speaking really just to the illicit transfer of oil, their imports of refined oil at sea are about a third less than before the sanctions regime began. It's very difficult to figure out what impact that those that sanctions enforcement regime is having because it's so opaque inside North Korea as to how they actually, what do they keep in strategic reserve, how they distribute it around the theater, around the peninsula, and how it affects KJU's decision-making overall.
An area we do not focus enough on are the threats associated with weapons proliferation, specifically in regards to North Korea. Reports show that North Korea has exported conventional arms and ballistic missiles for decades and has proliferated these arms to countries like Syria, which pose a serious threat to our international security. Admiral Davidson, as best as you can in this unclassified setting, can you provide us with better situation awareness on this issue? Two, are there concerns that North Korea is proliferating nuclear materials? And three, how can we do better to address this concern?
It's well known, I think, across the United States and our allies that North Korea has long been a proliferator of nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities around the globe. That's, I think, part and parcel, and in fact, I should really say the basis of why we're going after denuclearizing the peninsula, because they are not a reliable country on the globe. And it causes instability in areas that we don't want to see. I think to get to more details on this, sir, I'd like to rather take that into a classified setting, if I could.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I wanted to follow up on the line of questioning. We've had a lot of discussion about our relationship with the allies and our importance of that in the Indo-Pacific region. And specifically, Admiral Davidson, you talked about how in the fall of last year we really started focusing on that, stepped it up, and I applaud that. I think that's great. I wanted to just mention that March 13th, the B-52 bombers, our B-52s, conducted routine training in the South China Sea for the second time this month. And I think that's very, very important for the freedom of navigation operations that we have in the region. But it appears that many of our allies in the Pacific are reluctant to conduct the same type of freedom of navigation activities. So I was wondering your thoughts on that, and can we expect to see our allies and partners support this effort in the future?
If I could, ma'am, the bomber patrols that we use really around the whole of the region and not just in the South China Sea are to maintain our readiness and to understand how others respond in the region. We don't actually use them for freedom of navigation operations.
Okay.
Those are training missions and how they're employed. To the point about maritime forces doing freedom of navigation operations, though, we've encouraged all nations really to step up their operations in the South China Sea. And if they're not capable of taking a policy decision to actually do the very assertive freedom of navigation operations we do them more assertively across the globe and always have in the United States to enforce these international rights. If other countries aren't willing to do that, we're perfectly happy to see them operate in the international sea space that is the South China Sea. It demonstrates that it's an international concern to maintain that open, free, and open sea and airspace. But certainly, and we welcome people to do it unilaterally as well as with us and in other multilateral forums. Randy, you got anything you want to add?
I would agree with all that, and I would just add, given the expansive nature of China's claim, everything inside the 9-dash line, presence operations are valuable in and of themselves, even if it's not a direct 12 nautical mile challenge of a feature claimed by China or any other party. So presence, as Admiral Davidson said, is extraordinarily important given the expansive nature of their claim.
Okay, great. As far as the partnerships go, we have several compacts set to expire in the coming years, like the Compact of Free Association States, which impacts our relationship with them, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. So can you expand on the importance of these agreements and whether we should continue to fund them or should we let them expire?
We look forward to working with Congress in the hopes of continuing to fund them based on the needs. Over time, it's our hope that the requirements will be less given the state of their economic development, but for the foreseeable future, we think there will be need, and the compact relationship is mutually beneficial. We do make certain pledges with respect to their defense, but we also gain access, we gain support in international fora, that we have a special relationship with these compact states that we want to extend.
Admiral?
If I could just add, Madam, those three compact states are the connective tissue between the United States and the Western Pacific. We fought and bled in those lands during World War II, and the relationship that we've sustained in this compact, I think it's important to maintain that going well into the future.
I wanted to mention Japan just a little bit. Had an opportunity to travel there last year, as well as South Korea. And there's been a period of heightened tension between South Korea and Japan. I know it goes back a long ways. So I was just wondering, can you kind of give an update on that relationship and the efforts that the department is doing to undertake to try to bridge this divide?
I commented a little bit earlier, Congresswoman, about the Enforcement Coordination Cell in Yokosuka, which we're using to enforce UN sanctions against North Korea. And Japanese and Korean officers are sitting side by side right in that headquarters with United States officers, and in fact, other officers enlisted from allies and partners from across the region and indeed across the globe. I think that's a very positive sign because it's providing the transparency and the collaboration and cooperation of what the sea and air forces are doing in that sanctions regime to each party. I can tell you I've talked extensively with both the Chief of Defense from Korea and the Chief of Defense in Japan about at least the military incidents that had occurred earlier this year, and things seem to be calmer right now.
Very good.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, I like the way you enforce the rules. Thank you very much for the courtesy of calling on me and my colleagues. My
Gives
apologies.
me purpose here, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
My apologies to my colleagues for jumping in front of them. Mr. Schriver, we have had a discussion about the influence of China throughout the Pacific, particularly Pacific Islands. What is the best way for the United States to be present, to expand or at least maintain our position? I noted the Admiral Davidson just talked about the history back in World War II and beyond. So if you could elaborate on that, not just with the Pacific Islands, but beyond in the entire region. Let's leave India aside for just a moment, but the others. Thank you.
Well, I think our engagement is very important with respect to the Pacific Islands. Both Admiral Davidson and I have led interagency delegations there within the last 6 months. But it's really providing an alternative that's whole of government. As was mentioned earlier, some of these countries don't have militaries. They have law enforcement entities, so we bring our Coast Guard in, we bring other agencies in to really create approaches that meet their needs, which are very significant: illegal fishing, criminal activity, et cetera. So we have to fashion approaches that meet their needs and provide an alternative to what China or any other country might provide. And I'd also add that we have like-minded partners that are looking at Oceania. Australia has its Step Up program. New Zealand has its Reset. We're all looking to do better. And with respect to broader approaches in the region, I think it's the same. There is blowback from how China is approaching some of these relationships and the debt trap diplomacy, predatory economics, but we've got to be there as well with alternatives. And I think a demand signal is there, and we're doing our best to meet that demand signal with quality engagement and meaningful engagement that meets their interests and needs.
Admiral Davidson, would you like to add anything to that?
Just one more specific thing. We've undertaken an initiative to look at our defense attaches and where they're positioned, particularly across the Pacific Island chain, and we've actually taken some near-term action to expand that network immediately. But I completely agree with all of Mr. Schriver's comments.
I'd like to drill down, but not in the next 2 minutes, on what specific things we should be doing. And why don't we take another minute or so, and then maybe I have a follow-up question, but let's go down to specifics. What is it? It's military attaches, fine. What about the rest of the government, the whole of government? Mr. Schriver, if you'd like to do it, or Admiral, jump in.
Well, as I mentioned, whole of government are bringing in our Coast Guard where there aren't militaries. So they have, for example, shipwrighter program agreements with some of the countries that assist them in monitoring their sovereign territorial waters for the purposes of preventing illegal fishing, other criminal activity. We have National Guard state partnership programs in place where there are Pacific Island countries that have militaries. We just expanded that to include Fiji through the state of Nevada. So there are a number of tools that go beyond just the engagement, the presence of attachés, and we're working to build those out. Our foreign military financing with State Department has been stepped up in the region. Fiji would be an example of that as well, where we're helping with their peacekeeping forces.
Well, I was kind of chumming for you to mention the Peace Corps and the return of the Peace Corps to the Micronesia area, so I'll mention it myself. There's a whole host of things. I just draw my colleagues' attention to the whole of government and the fact that in the President's budget, most of the whole of government, with the exception of the military, is significantly reduced, and therefore our presence beyond the military is lacking. I'll let it go at that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Admiral, I want to thank you for mentioning Communist China and their use of One Belt, One Road in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere in our backyard. And I think it's interesting that Vietnam asked or allowed, whichever way we want to put it, us to park the Carl Vinson right there. And I think that's, if you wanted proof that you can't trust Communist China, even their neighbors don't trust Communist China. And their movement into the Western Hemisphere concerns me. We're not here to talk about that today, but I don't think we as a United States have paid enough attention to our backyard in the Western Hemisphere, and I'm afraid we're going to wake up one day and have a Chinese base in that Western Hemisphere, and that's something that I don't think we can afford to allow. So with that said, Assistant Secretary Schriver, as Communist China continues to grow both physically and virtually around the world, what impacts is this having on the United States' ability to strengthen our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific regions? Are we at risk of losing our partnerships because of Communist China and their use of One Belt, One Road to buy their way into favor?
Quite frankly, I think we're more often than not the preferred partner. I think a lot of Chinese engagement has resulted in a backlash because their intent is not benign. They come in with the goal of entrapping countries in many instances. When we go in, we want genuine partnership. We want to help countries address their needs. All we really want is countries to be sovereign and have the ability to protect that sovereignty and their independence and freedom for maneuver. So I think we're the preferred partner, but we've got to show up and we've got to be a good, reliable partner to them.
I agree with you in that things like trade relations, quite honestly, in many cases have as much, if not more, to do with peace than the military strength. And I think it's unfortunate that when the TPP was being discussed, it became a political football that got kicked around by both sides, quite honestly. And we need to have the trade relationships in Asia, and we need trade relationships with countries other than China in Asia. General Abrams, you've stated that you have a persistent need for ISR. I know of no commander who thinks that they have enough ISR. The geographic challenges of the Korean Peninsula, the size of it. And so in your first 120 days as commander, your support with ISR to detect attack as early as possible, are you receiving enough support there? And if not, what do you need from Congress as we push forward with the National Defense Authorization Act to do that?
Congressman, we are adequately resourced with ISR during armistice conditions as it relates to the current reduction intentions on the peninsula. So I want to be clear, I'm not ringing the five-alarm fire bell right now on ISR. But as we look to the future, as conditions might change, if they change negatively, then our stance and our posture is not adequate to provide us an unblinking eye to give us early warning and indicators. And I give you a couple of examples during the closed session of exact capability that we would need, but suffice to say, we're short to be able to do that if things start to turn bad.
I will tell you the JSTARS fly out of Robbins Air Force Base. I'm glad that we're starting to do the depot maintenance work at Robbins Air Force Base. Hopefully we can get that turnaround time shortened and get more of those planes in the air. I want to just leave you with a couple of things. I mentioned this to the Secretary of the Air Force this morning. Hurricane Michael hit the southeastern United States just under 6 months ago. We have approximately 3 legislative days left that are not fly-in, fly-out days before we leave for the Easter break, and we're yet to have a disaster bill passed. If that is not passed before we leave for Easter, then it will delay things for weeks, potentially even another month. I hope that the people at the DOD will help hold our feet to the fire to get that done prior to leaving. And I would mention to you that you are about 6 months from sequester.
The gentleman's time has expired. If he wants to wrap up that thought, he's more than welcome to.
I would just caution you that the calendar's ticking, and we need some type of agreement on a cap deal, Mr. Chairman. I think you would agree with me on that sooner rather than later so that we can adopt our National Defense Authorization Act.
And I would echo that thought. I mean, as you mentioned in the outset, having FY19, October 1, you knew how much money you were going to have. You were good to go, and that was the first time in I don't know how long. You know, to get that again for FY20 would be enormously important, and I think it's the greatest burden in Congress and the White House. We need to find a way to work together and get that deal. I think it's there to be made. Obsessing over the budget caps that were set back in 2011 in a situation where, I mean, Mr. Turner and I had a robust disagreement exactly what that situation was, but we did agree today that it was all part of the controversy of trying to figure out what to do about the budget, the debt ceiling, and how do we get the deficit and the debt under control. But to jeopardize the entire discretionary budget over an amount of money that isn't going to have any impact on our long-term debt and deficit is the height of irresponsibility to my mind. We need to work together, and get, certainly for DOD, but for the entire discretionary budget. So I appreciate the gentleman making that point. Thank you. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you. I'm going to, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming today and for testifying. I'm going to continue asking the question that our Representative Larson and Representative Cisneros were talking about. I also serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Asia Subcommittee, and I had the opportunity to ask the same kinds of questions of Mr. Victor Cha recently that had to do with the exercises that are conducted overseas that have been suspended in some cases, and I'm just trying to triangulate the answer. You mentioned that you had been asked to be creative about effectively redesigning, reimagining the exercises so that they could be effective. He mentioned that he was concerned that if those reimagined exercises continued in the capacity that they were, which was in some cases not actually in the places they ought to be, that by the springtime he would be anxious that we should be returning to actually exercising in the places that we plan to have those scenarios actually unfold. And do you have that same kind of concern, whereas if we continue to sort of exercise off-site, for lack of a better descriptor, which is how he was alluding to it, that we are in some ways less ready than we would have been otherwise?
Congresswoman, I did read those comments, and I've got the utmost respect for Mr. Cha, but he's not fully read in on how we conducted these exercises. I prefer to, I'm happy to give the members all the details you want on things that we have done with the exercise designed. But I want to assure you and all the members, this exercise was probably more rigorous, more challenging, and stressed our systems more appropriately than we have in many years past. I prefer to go into how we were able to do that in a closed session. But the department is committed. I know the Secretary of Defense is committed to us being able to sustain that readiness and continue to train and exercise as we need to keep it as a fight tonight capability.
Thank you, and I will look forward to having that conversation in the next session. My next question is for Mr. Schriver and Admiral. It has to do a little bit with the bases that are currently in Djibouti. And if you could look kind of at the map of the area that we're talking about today and think about if there are any vulnerable countries that you can think of that are maybe will maybe succumb to the lure of China and their money and their resources. Could you identify what countries those are that you would be maybe worried could be co-opted into being a Djibouti-type situation?
Before naming specific countries, I think it's important to note that China's opportunistic wherever they see the conditions, and generally they are weaker, in some cases authoritarian states, vulnerable economies, et cetera, where their predatory economics have attraction. I think what we have seen is attempts in places like Sri Lanka and the Maldives and Malaysia that were quite robust and ultimately somewhat thwarted by the elections. In Maldives, Mr. Yamin lost re-election. In Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksans were replaced, at least temporarily. And in Malaysia, we now have Mr. Mahathir in his second turn as leader, and much of that is a result of China's overplaying their hands. Certainly in the Pacific Islands, we see some vulnerable states that China is approaching, and there's been some press coverage on some of those. For example, Vanuatu, which is I've visited, others in the administration have visited to assure them that there are alternatives. And shine a light on what happened in some of these other countries so that they don't fall prey to it.
Thank you, and I have one last question with my one last minute, which has to do with that. And I think that people do say that China is more successful in developing economic security and security relationships with countries because it doesn't have the same kind of regulatory requirements and restrictions as we do in terms of human rights and vetting and anti-corruption requirements and those sorts of things. And you mentioned that that our values compete well in this area. And so I wanted to ask you: do you believe that countries choose China over us because of these requirements that we have, or do you think that we are able to continue to have our values and also be competitive in the environment that we're in right now?
I think, as Admiral Davidson, I think, alluded to earlier, our values are key to our ability to compete, and there is an attraction to it. I think the countries that are most susceptible oftentimes have weak authoritarian governments that are willing to engage in activities that are, quite frankly, corrupt. But what we offer, even if it's not in the vast sums that China can come to the table with, is clean, transparent, open approaches that have long-term benefit to the people, not just the leadership.
I appreciate that, and I agree with that. Thanks so much for your time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Davidson, intelligence suggests China has made strong progress in the development of hypersonic weapons that pose unique challenges to America's current missile defense systems. First question, do you have a judgment about whether China is apt to use hypersonic weapons in a regional or strategic scenario?
Sir, they don't have capability that they would use, I think, in combat immediately, but their initial capability, I think, is in the horizon of just the next few years, yes.
With respect, then, to China's expected capabilities, are you planning for them to have conventional tipped warheads, nuclear tipped warheads, or both?
I think the nation needs to be prepared for any outcome there, both.
And what are our current hypersonic defense capabilities?
Well, as you indicated in the preface to your question, sir, our ability of our integrated air and missile defense systems to handle hypersonics is short of the capability. They have a different, flight profile trajectory that makes it hard for current sensing systems to maintain track on those things, and it makes it hard for our current interception systems to actually make the turn and do the intercepts. So continued advancement here by the department, and I think you're going to see, be pleased with the down payment in the FY20 budget. Continued advancement here in both sensing, which is going to require an airborne or space layer, as well as continued advancement in our ability to intercept these weapons, defeat them. I think you're going to see that, the beginnings of that in the 20 budget.
How long do you anticipate it will be before our defense capabilities are such that we can rely on them?
Sir, I'll have to take that for the record. Money is a resource here, that is a factor, but so is time. And I think Dr. Griffin, and as the services pursue this capability, I think they could give you a more refined answer than I could, but I need to do some coordination with them to get back to you.
Well, that flows into my next question. How much more money do you believe we need in the next fiscal year defense budget in order to adequately accelerate defense capabilities to hypersonic weapons?
Sir, if I could take that question down below, I can begin to address that, but I'm going to have to take that for the record as well.
All right, thank you. We've moved from defense now to offense. Assistant Secretary Schriver, the Missile Defense Review opens the aperture for hypersonic glide defense. What investments are necessary to get the Department of Defense developing such a capability for the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility? And then follow up on that with, in your judgment, how long will it be before America has an effective offensive hypersonic capability?
I can only answer at the very general level because there are parts of the department that deal with both the offense and the defense equation. But I do think you will see this reflected in the 2020 budget, an increase in resources both on the defense and offense side. I do think time is of the essence, given where China and competitors may be on this. And of course, it's not limited to hypersonics, but as was pointed out, all the enabling sensors and other capabilities that China's pursuing as well, because there's a variety of ways to deal with this capability, and it may not only be shooting down a missile, it may be disabling other aspects of their infrastructure. But to get into more detail would probably need to be in another setting, and I'd probably have to have the support of colleagues who have more of the technical background.
Well, to use a football analogy, sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Do you have anything that you wish to add about our development of offensive capabilities, offensive hypersonic capabilities?
Only that I know that it's been identified as a priority and it's being resourced at greater levels in our budget.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and for your service. Admiral Davidson, North Korea has a variety of sources of illicit funding, and U.S. Indo-Pacific Command supports the enforcement of UN security resolution sanctions. I know you spoke to Mr. Carbajal a few minutes ago about sanctions enforcement, but can you speak to how Russia and China are living up to their responsibilities to do the same?
Well, I think in the diplomatic space, both Russia and China continue to try to undermine the sanctions effort by proposing relief to sanctions at the UN. But that's certainly not helpful in what I think should be the world's objective, to get to a denuclearized North Korea. I also believe that Russia kind of confounds our initiatives across the region by direct diplomatic engagements with other countries to garner the votes that they need to prevent these sanctions. I can tell you that China in the maritime space, using terrestrial sensors, using airborne sensors, they're watching how we do the sanctions enforcement regime. They're offering zero assistance. I can't say that they are preventing our ships and aircraft from doing their mission, but they're certainly not monitoring their own territorial seas very well, and they're not adding to the picture at all. And they continue to undermine the effort at the UN as well.
Thank you. So I guess along those same lines, you spoke earlier about how Russia plays a spoiler role in the region. Can you talk a little bit more about the specifics around that and what that entails?
There's one of the things that they tell other nations in the region is that our sea and our desire to maintain an open sea and airspace in the South China Sea, for example, it should not be our objective. Yet they use that same sea and airspace themselves and actually use the open seas and airways to, fly threatening bomber profiles to our allies, and in fact on the United States as well. I think that's a high form of hypocrisy. They're doing some engagements in the region where they're seeking to either gain access in a commercial fashion or in a science fashion that could lend itself to military capabilities. That's been upsetting. The good news there is that some of these other countries have at least called us and notified us of that. And they've made it, they've partnered with China in a large exercise last fall that was in Russia. They just are unhelpful in the whole of the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic space.
General Abrams or Mr. Schriver, do you have anything to add on that front?
Congresswoman, I will tell you that there is, we continue to see positive effects on the sanctions. Admiral Davidson briefed it earlier, but to reiterate what the Admiral said, the Chinese can and should do much, much more to meet their obligations in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions.
So what do you think this all kind of boils down to? What do you think the general effect is having, and what do we need to do about it from your end?
Well, China is attempting to undermine the rules-based international order to their own benefit or to the benefit of people or entities or regimes, frankly, that they seek to partner with. It's not helpful.
And same for Russia. Okay, so along those lines, then, and the president has made the decision to cancel U.S. participation in Key Resolve and Full Eagle. What message do you think ending those operational norms with the ROK well, the White House is saying we won't impose further sanctions on North Korea because of his relationship with Kim Jong-un. What do you think that message sends to, what message do you think that sends to our allies and partners in Asia and to Russia and China themselves?
Congresswoman, if I could, just to be precise, and this is not semantics, key resolve and full legal were not canceled. We have concluded that exercise regime that was in effect for about 35 years that was probably necessary, designed, optimized, based on the situation on the peninsula vis-a-vis bellicose and aggressive and provocative behavior from the DPRK. We have since transitioned now in accordance with guidance from Secretary Shanahan and Minister of Defense Jung from the Republic of Korea in their statement. So we've concluded that previous exercise regime, and they've given us the green light to develop a new set of exercise regimes so that we can continue to meet and maintain our readiness requirements.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I believe it was Chairman Smith who said during his opening statement that on the Korean Peninsula, we are at a high water mark since the cessation of conflict during the Korean War. I wanted to give General Abrams and Admiral Davidson an opportunity to reflect on how those improving conditions have manifested. What is the evidence that we see, and what do we expect from the trend lines as it relates to the overall status of conflict on the Korean Peninsula?
Congressman, if you go back just 2 years to 2017, during the height of missile tests, nuclear weapons tests by the DPRK, I would describe, and I was not the commander then, but I was certainly watching very closely as the U.S. Army's force provider to have forces ready should crisis be required. I would characterize our posture and our stance as we were in a low crouch. We were increasing our stockages, increasing our force posture. We made the decision to deploy an additional very capable integrated air and missile defense system called THAAD. You know, things were very tense on the peninsula. People were at the low ready. Now, compare and contrast that, juxtapose that on a 2019, and there is a palpable air of calm on the peninsula. We're able to sustain and we continue to train and maintain our readiness, but simultaneously along the demilitarized zone, on the West Sea, the East Sea, along the northern limit line, inside the Joint Security Area, that for the first time since 1976, the Joint Security Area is now 100% demilitarized. All of that are evidence, I would say, of how I can say confidently that things have, the tension is reduced significantly.
Admiral Davidson, do you have anything to add to that?
No, sir, but I will add that the readiness of our forces are key in our mind, and we want to make sure that both the tactical forces and the operational level forces, you know, the headquarters that coordinate between the United States and the Republic of Korea, all that training and readiness is sound. As General Abrams indicated earlier, we're keeping a close eye on any changes in the capability set, whether it's in conventional forces in North Korea, whether it's in nuclear, the potential for a nuclear test, and missile testing, and we'll be ready to respond if should those indicators say they're on a different trajectory than what General Abrams just described.
And Mr. Schriver, it seems to me that this new era of calm has been ushered in by an unprecedented level of engagement with the administration on the actors, the players, the chairman in North Korea. Have you drawn any conclusions about the actions that have been taken by the administration and the extent to which they've contributed to the new sense of calm that General Abrams articulated?
Well, I think the unprecedented step of meeting leader to leader has made this environment what it is. Ultimately, that...
And what it is safer, right?
Tensions are down, and I would describe it as safer in terms of avoidance of an immediate conflict, particularly one that's unintended or unwanted. We do need North Korea to take advantage of this environment and fulfill Chairman Kim's pledge to denuclearize.
And shifting gears briefly to hypersonics, Ms. Schriver, are we ahead or behind China in hypersonics now?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to give you a precise answer on that, other than I'm seized with a sense of urgency, as I believe our department is, that we need to invest on both the defense and the offensive side to make sure that our competitive advantages are maintained.
And what are the consequences if we don't? If we are demonstrably behind China in hypersonics going forward, how do you think that impacts the balance of power globally?
Increased risk and greater vulnerability for our ability to impact our security interests and our broad interests in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with General Abrams. General Abrams, thank you very much for coming into my office yesterday. I appreciated the discussion. And I just want to start by saying that when your commander, our commander-in-chief, handed you a deck that meant you could not continue your prime exercises in this theater, I learned yesterday that you innovated remarkably and have improved upon the old exercises to modernize them, to make them more full spectrum, and to adapt to the current situation. And you deserve a lot of credit for that. I know that's not easy to do in the U.S. military, and I appreciate that very much. Admiral Davidson, you stated in your testimony that North Korea will remain the most immediate challenge until we achieve the final fully verifiable denuclearization as committed to by Chairman Kim Jong-un at the summit in June of 2018. AST Schriver, so we gave up the exercises. What did we gain from the summit?
I think we gained an opportunity to engage in a way that could be productive if North Korea is prepared to take the difficult steps in the direction of denuclearization.
That's an opportunity that didn't exist before?
I think leader-to-leader engagement did create an unprecedented opportunity. But North Korea has not taken the steps to fulfill Chairman Kim's pledge, and we're disappointed that they haven't come to the table in a serious manner.
Are you surprised?
Having worked on this in some form or another for almost 30 years, I think I've seen a lot of different approaches, none of which have been successful. I think this is the best opportunity that North Korea will ever have. Whether or not they make the strategic choice, that's difficult to say.
Why would they give up their nuclear weapons, Mr. Schriver?
I think there's a better path and a better future for the country, quite frankly, and I don't think their weapons are making them more secure. I think, it was only a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that we were at a period of very high tensions and possible military action. I don't think these weapons are making them more safe and secure.
So you talked about this, the fact that tensions are down, you said. My colleague just said there's a new level of calm. Have tensions ever been higher than they were at the beginning of this administration, when North Korea's hot-headed leader was exchanging tweets with ours?
We have had periods of heightened tension. I think 1994, Secretary Perry used to say that's the closest he came to war while he was Secretary of Defense.
Right, while he was Secretary. But has it ever been as dangerous as it was a couple years ago? I guess my point is that it's one thing to talk about tensions being down, but if you're just solving your own problem, the tensions that you created yourself, and as a result, we are where we were before in terms of negotiations, and that North Korea hasn't given up anything. We now know from public intelligence reports that they are actually continuing their nuclear weapons development, so they're farther along than they were at any time. Literally today, they are farther along than they have been at any time in American history. And all we gained after giving up our exercises is a quote-unquote opportunity that nobody is surprised that the chairman hasn't taken. Then where do you think this goes next? And what diplomatic leverage do we have at this point?
Yeah, the choice for North Korea is very clear, and it's a stark one. They can continue to live in isolation. They can continue.
I understand their choice. What leverage do we have?
Well, the maintenance of sanctions, I think, continues to put pressure on North Korea.
So you think sanctions are helpful?
I do.
So then why did the president just cancel the latest sanctions?
As I understand it, none of the sanctions have been removed or changed since the tweet. As the White House...
Since the tweet. So you would disagree with the idea of removing sanctions. That would be unhelpful.
I think it's helpful to maintain pressure. The decisions on future sanctions are beyond my purview.
Undoing pressure by tweet would not be helpful. I want to just shift focus for a second to India. You previously mentioned how important our relationship is with India. How does India's recent purchasing of the S-400 and the leasing of Russian nuclear submarines impact our relationship going forward?
The decision to procure S-400s has not been gone to contract or completed. We're very keen to see them make an alternative choice. We're working with them to provide potential alternatives. I think it would be an unfortunate decision if they chose to pursue that, and of course we have the legislation hanging over all of that. The legislation is not designed to be an impediment in the growing strategic partnership we have with India. It's designed to impose cost on Russia and consequence for Russia. So one way or another, we want to work through it because India is an important emerging strategic partner for us.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Time expires. Before I call Mr. Banks, we're going to do the classified hearing at 12:15. So we're going to be wrapped here before 12:15, no matter how many people are here. And we're going to go upstairs for the classified at 12:15. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Davidson, in the past you mentioned that Indo-PACOM only has a quarter of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities required to address the range of threats in the AOR. For FY19, the CNO included sonobuoys on the Navy's unfunded priority list, and again in FY20, a portion of the funding request again appears in the UPL. In looking at your command's requirements in the current and foreseeable security environment, would you also include assets like sonobuoys as a critical ISR shortfall, especially in light of submarine activity in your AOR?
Yes, sir. Given the ongoing expansion of Chinese submarine operations in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, as well as new capability that the Russians will be introducing into the theater over the next couple of years with the Severdinsk-class cruise missile-capable submarine, sensing like sonobuoys, it's going up in value and need.
Thank you for that. Shifting gears, yesterday we had Secretary Shanahan in the same seat that you are in today. I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked the Secretary yesterday. Even if every Congress and President agree on the goal of a 355-ship fleet for decades to come, we will not reach the desired goal for at least, I said, 40 years yesterday without a firm commitment. The Secretary pushed back and said 18 years. I'll give the Secretary 18 years on the low end, and some experts say 40 years on the high end. In light of that, what do you expect the balance of forces between the U.S. and China to be by the time we achieve a 355-ship fleet? And when do you believe that it is realistic to achieve this goal?
To your first question, Congressman, I think we're going to lose our quantitative edge in about the 2025 timeframe. I think that's going to be a challenge for our equities in the region, absolutely. I can't comment how much faster or slower the need needs to happen here. There are some shipbuilding limits, the capacity in the United States to actually produce the ships. But I think the Navy's force structure assessment will take that fully into account as they come forward later in the year with it.
Thank you for that. Mr. Schriver, in your testimony, you said, quote, "There is an active North Korean effort to undermine sanctions and sow political division in their execution. North Korea has turned to the use of illicit ship-to-ship transfers off China's coast to evade caps on importing refined petroleum and the sale of textiles and coal. These restrictions were imposed and periodically strengthened as a result of North Korea's illegal weapons development activity dating back to March 2016, end quote. With that, what is the logic of the Trump administration considering lessening sanctions on North Korea and rewarding North Korea if they won't comply with the original sanctions to begin with?
Yeah, as I said, I'm not aware that sanctions have been removed or changed. I think it's very important to keep pressure on, and it's, I think, a defensible statement. We wouldn't be where we are today without the pressure that North Korea has felt. Your point about, well, quoting my statement about China, we will not be successful unless China does more to enforce sanctions themselves, including the activity in their territorial water, period.
Good. On that same note, Admiral, you've talked in the past about naming and shaming those entities that abet sanctions evasion in North Korea. Have we done that? Have we made any successful efforts to, at all, to minimize sanctions evasion?
There have been a number of flag states that the United States has engaged, and as well as other countries, to sideline vessels that have been participating in the illicit transfer of oil to North Korea, as well as some of the ownership companies and shippers involved. And I think the key is to disrupting that providing network as we go forward. But there has been engagement at the diplomatic level, to your point, naming and shaming of these individuals, and we have seen robust action from other countries in that regard.
So you have seen progress, or we hope to see progress?
Yes, sir. We have seen progress, and it will continue.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I've heard a lot of questions, and a lot of the ones that I was going to ask, so I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, if you would. I think Congresswoman Houlihan touched upon this a little bit, talking about Persian Gulf ports and China's, presence in that part of the world, a little bit outside Euro-AO. But the national security strategy, national defense strategy does talk about reorienting ourselves for near-peer competition to include China. And I think a lot of people think of this only in military-to-military engagement, but you often talk about the economic aspects of all of this. And, I was curious, we haven't really talked about Afghanistan. I've been reading some reports about China starting to have a little bit of military-to-military cooperation with the Afghan national government. And we certainly know that their relationship in Pakistan, thinking about One Belt, One Road and the port that they're developing there, and their ability to drive into Afghanistan, get into Central Asia and the Gulf. There's ports in Iran. I think the success of those ports, figures largely in that region, insecurity in Afghanistan. So it's kind of the back door to your AOR. So just thought I'd give you an opportunity to talk about, as the U.S. talks in negotiations with Taliban, talks about withdrawing, what kind of a footprint do you hope to see in Afghanistan, and what kind of a role, how important it is to your area of responsibility that the U.S. is present and has a strong relationship with the Afghan government?
I think it's critical. We are in Afghanistan first and foremost to protect the United States and protect Americans. If Ambassador Khalilzad is successful in the efforts to promote reconciliation, it is expected that there would still be some terrorist threat that would remain. And I would hope that, it is our objective that through those negotiations that we have the latitude to maintain a presence sufficient for that terrorist threat that may remain. In a post-reconciled environment, we would expect the Afghans themselves to deal with the terrorist threat. They certainly don't want that on their territory, at least the government in Kabul. So it will be conditions-based, and I think that's being reflected in our negotiations.
Sir, if I could just add quickly, I mentioned earlier that I think our U.S. values compete extraordinarily well, and they do in Afghanistan very much so. And when you look at China's, what can only be said, incarceration of more than what's estimated to be right now, I think 1.5 million people in the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, I think Afghanistan would view heavy Chinese involvement in their country and Chinese interests as a chilling factor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you both, particularly your families, for it's a team effort to serve, and thank you for your years of service. I want to go back to India for a moment. I agree. I think it was the ranking member who said it's a seminal, or perhaps the chairman, really one of the seminal alliances, I think, moving forward. What more can we do in our engagement with India? What more should we be doing? What more would you like to do? And how can this body help?
Sir, the signing of the COMCASA and the 2+2 meeting that the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State had last September in India, I think, is a breakthrough. Down at the operational level, we're working on an effort now to really operationalize the COMCASA. It's an agreement to, it's an IT, essentially, agreement. in which underpinning that we can do some information sharing and other things. There's an opportunity for us to share tactical flyaway kits and an operational planning system that I think will advance our relationship on a military-to-military level very, very well. I continue to make the point with them that our interoperability and compatibility going forward is, will be advantaged with the purchase of U.S. systems. That allows us to get to training, doctrine, tactical level coordination that's really powerful. So while they very much want to protect their non-aligned policy, the tactical and technical capability we get out of like systems will really advance that relationship down in the military space. Randy?
Yep. Thank you. And just on top of that, switching to space, how does China's growing capability, anti-sat, dazzling, their capabilities that they're essentially putting all over the globe in terms of tracking through One Belt, One Road, and through their debt diplomacy, how is that affecting you operationally? I'd leave it open to anyone on the panel.
It's a capability development in the battle space that would have an effect on the freedom of action of the entire joint force, not only in the Indo-Pacific Command, but really around the globe.
Switching to switching to Japan, do you believe, Mr. Schriver, it's time, I understand this is an internal Japanese issue, it's a very contentious political issue in terms of Article 9, we're taking a hard look at cost sharing, growing Chinese capabilities, U.S. can't do it alone, we're looking at losing a quantitative edge in terms of our fleet, as the Admiral just mentioned, by 2025. What can we do to talk to the Japanese about taking additional steps, taking that hard step internally and making those changes they need to their constitution to be a more effective military partner?
Well, you rightfully acknowledge it's a sovereign decision of the government of Japan and people there. I think the step to...
But they have a responsibility as an ally.
I think the step they took...
70-year construct now, and the world's changed.
I think the step they took to reinterpret Article 9 gave us greater flexibility and latitude, and we are taking advantage of that. Their new National Defense Program guidelines, when compared with our National Defense Strategy, revealed to us that there's nothing but open space for us to build this alliance out. I am not aware that the distinction between reinterpreting versus actually changing the Constitution is an impediment right now, but if it were to become one, we would certainly raise that with our Japanese friends.
Okay, just in the time I have remaining, Admiral, how does the Latin American angle, in terms of the 17 nations that you mentioned, participating, signing agreements, One Belt, One Road, how is that affecting your force laydown or force posture? Is it significant? What do we do going forward?
All those countries are actually in Southcom's area of responsibility. Right. I actually talked to Admiral Fowler just last night to make sure that I understood, and he wanted to understand my concerns as well. I think you're not seeing profound military action in the Southcom AOR right now. Last year, China did run a hospital ship down there with some medical capability.
Though I would note, just in my time remaining, I do understand they put a satellite tracking system in Argentina on land lease. So it's a road it's a trend we're seeing. And
we've seen other requests across the Indo-Pacific AOR, but the net result of which is the potential for more bases, places for China to operate out of base airplanes, fixed ships. The
gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Discussion upstairs. Ms. Loria, and when she's done, we're going to reconvene in 2212.
Well, thank you for being here today, and Admiral Davidson, it's especially good to see you again. I spent 4 years in the Western Pacific on a destroyer and then as the aide at 7th Fleet, so I'm familiar with the area, and what's most striking is the large distances that have to be covered. And I want to focus today especially on our challenges to do with logistics based off of those large distances in the Pacific. And our current Navy logistics enterprise is based on the ability to deliver fuel, parts, supplies in an uncontested environment. So I appreciate that you also see this as a vulnerability in your comments that you provided in preparation for the hearing.
While China continues to develop weapons such as the DF-26, they've called it the Guam killer, which gives you an idea of the range and what they could intend to use that for, that threaten our ability to deliver logistics from the fixed bases we've relied on for more than 50 years. But we really haven't changed our tactics or procedures with regards to logistics and practiced those very recently, such as console ops with our TAOs in theater for about a decade. So do you see logistics as an Achilles heel in the Pacific theater?
Certainly advancements with our logistics tactics, so to speak, is important going forward. We actually have done some console ops here in the last 5 years. We just concluded the Pacific Blitz exercise as well, which merges essentially what was a tactical exercise and a logistics, both Navy Marine Corps exercises, to exercise that capability. Clearly, recapitalization of our sea lift system is going to be critically important as it's aging out and really has propulsion plants that are, expiring in capability and our ability to maintain them.
I was going to comment on that as well because we had the opportunity to hear from Admiral Busby as the Maritime Administrator as well as from U.S. Transcom, and we focused within the Sea Power Subcommittee as well on the age of the sea lift fleet, and on any given day, if say 50% of the sea lift fleet were unavailable, what kind of impact would that have? Because when we were briefed, that was basically what was unavailable at a snapshot in time. What impact would that have on your most limiting O plan and ability to carry that out within the theater?
It's a risk to our troops and all of our people that are forward in the region if there is any delay in our ability to deliver the logistics in accordance with the O plans.
And going back to the console ops and the availability of tankers within the region, currently in our MSP program, there are no tankers whatsoever. And do you see that as a need in order to execute your most pressing O plan?
Yes, ma'am. The Military Sea Lift Command is also exploiting commercial opportunities to do some of these things as well.
And lastly, many of our ships in the theater are heavily reliant on shore infrastructure, such as in Guam and Yokosuka and Sasebo and different areas around the theater. Are you taking any actions to harden that shore infrastructure or provide additional defenses for it to make sure that we can maintain the logistics necessary to carry out our two principal O plans within the area?
Yeah, certainly there are defensive capabilities in Guam I would like to see improved. We're using a mobile system right there now with THAAD on the ground as well as ship support from the threats that are extant. I think in the future we are going to need a more robust fixed site there so that our mobile sites can then be employed to support our expeditionary logistics and other basic needs around the region.
Well, and I'll wrap up by asking you the same question that I've asked all combatant commanders who've come before us is, on a different note, what percentage of your requested carrier presence have you received within the theater over the last 2 years?
It's about 70%.
Well, thank you, and as I'm the last to go today, I wanted to thank you all again for taking the time to brief us and help us be more informed on our decision-making process throughout the budget process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your testimony, answering questions. We are adjourned, and we'll reconvene in 2212 as soon as we can get up there.
Yes, I do.
The House Armed Services Committee wrapping up the public portion of this hearing. Members now heading into a closed-door session. Well, coming up here in just a bit on C-SPAN 3, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will be testifying on the State Department's 2020 budget request before the House Foreign Affairs Committee.